Okay. Perfect. All right, folks, thank you for joining me in whatever form you're joining us. We are here live in the North Branch of the Peoria Public Library, but we are, of course, also casting on Zoom. I'll be bouncing back and forth here, obviously trying to let people into the Zoom room as we talk. Thank you so much for joining us, me for our third Building Better Media Habits session. See, these are my students trying to get extra credit. Yeah. Today we're going to talk about fake news, misinformation, and disinformation, but I also want to talk about obviously a huge news event that's happening right now, which is certainly something that is rife with misinformation and disinformation. And I'm just sort of curious how people are taking this event in, what type of news they're consuming related to this, which I think will get us into a conversation about fake news, disinformation, and misinformation. And that's obviously the events in Ukraine. If I can click through here. So I've got a bunch of examples of how the news is circulating and what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in Russia, responses obviously throughout Europe and the world. But I'm just curious if anyone would like to share, like, you know, what type of news are you consuming related to what's going on in the Ukraine, as far as where you're getting that news, how much of it you're consuming. Anybody want to share?
I prefer to read the articles as opposed to watching videos and read from top to bottom. Different from like Google News aggregate, basically I'll pick which ones to read.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't find, I've been to war, so I know how terrible it is. So the videos, certainly these type of video stuff, because they're actually live, which is subject we haven't really seen before, as far as they're actually filming the terrible things that are happening on the ground. So that's insightful. But as far as what the news reports, I don't think it's the videos, the news. I don't watch any of those because they're almost automatically somewhat biased. Depending on what you watch. So
Right.
I prefer to read it than to watch it.
So in that example, contrasting like print or digital, you know, written word versus like, especially like television news, right? And how it's being framed on television, right? Great, thank you for sharing. Other thoughts? How we're consuming news about opting out? Yeah, go ahead.
I've been listening to radio reports during my and trying to intentionally not look at social on Twitter or Facebook, which I'm on for work, so I see some of those things, but I'm really trying to resist just clicking on those and getting drawn into whatever video may or may not be real or fabricated or whatever. Just making an intentional effort to listen to what someone on a news station is reporting, either from Ukraine or people who might have better access to that than trying to get sucked into trying to decide what is real and what's not in this way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think part of that, right, is when you're consuming this stuff on social media, which is something we'll get into here, there is that sense that it kind of never stops, right? I mean, looking at these things on television the last week or two, it hasn't really stopped on TV either. But the social media aspect of it, as far as the disconnected amount of information from all of these different accounts that you're seeing, reports, live footage, altered footage from like a completely different incident from 10 years ago or whatever that's been doctored, right? And it's really difficult, especially if you're seeking out information, to like figure out, okay, is this legit? Is this not legit? Is this like actually real because it's coming from a non-traditional source, and maybe something coming from a more conventional news organization is slanted one way or another, or has a certain agenda that it might want to put forward, right? And I think, as you allude to, like, especially in an incident like this, it's extremely easy to just fall completely into the rabbit hole of what's happening, right? There's so much happening that if you start, it's really easy, or it's really hard to stop. Anybody else want to share about their?
I do like NPR radio listening.
Yeah.
There are some very good commentators that are in the Ukraine or were in the Ukraine or Russia and had to leave.
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? Gentlemen, you want to share? You don't have to. Just anybody opting out entirely, like deciding not to pay attention to this at all.
Definitely limited myself.
Mhm.
It's fairly impressive.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one of the big things that you've seen, I have seen at least a lot of discussion about this, right? Because I think one of the, especially for younger folks who are heavily reliant on social media and digital platforms to get their news and are so connected to those devices, and who maybe haven't experienced war, quote unquote, in the way that we're potentially seeing here, or seeing these conflicts as they're being covered by the media. There's been a lot of conversation about how much of this should you consume? Like, should you check in a couple of times a day and then just opt out for the reasons that we've discussed? Who are the trusted sources? What is the best way to get this information? One of the local TV stations asked me to do an interview last week, and that was kind of the angle they were thinking about. It's like, there's so much info out there. Like, is it healthy to be trying to consume all of this at all times, right? And just talking to people, I think there's a sense that, like, especially in the States, right, we've been trained, especially on social media, to raise awareness or sharing it in that way. And what's really complicated about a circumstance like a literal war and death and destruction is that there's a tendency to want to raise awareness or share to make other people aware of what's going on, to maybe also feel like you're doing something, to be part of not the war effort, but you're raising awareness, and that's the best you can do, like, halfway around the world. And that's a situation, I've got a few slides about this, where that emotional charge of wanting to make people aware of what's happening or advocate for an issue is a great recipe for sharing things that are not true, right? That if you're passionate about it, even just like raising awareness about something horrible that's happening halfway around the world, that maybe lends you, gets you in a situation where you're going to share something that's not totally accurate because you just feel like you got to do something. I was thinking about what is the experience of getting information in 2022 about an invasion, about a war that the Western world really seems to care about and is focusing a lot on. And I think, as a couple of people mentioned, what this looks like if you're looking at the random sources or random information on social media. And so I just took a bunch of screenshots and have some examples here to get us into a convo about fake news, about misinformation. So one of the more interesting genres of accounts that's popped up, and they existed before this, but there are these accounts that are essentially, as you can see on the left here, Ukrainian weapons tracker, and there's Russian weapons tracker and things like that, where they're using all of this user-generated and sometimes news organization footage to basically update people in real time about the different types of artillery and vehicles and things that are being used in these efforts. And, as a couple of people mentioned, there's really interesting live, quote unquote, footage of what this looks like. So this is just a random quick clip here. It's 16 seconds, but of what this looks like. So another one that's gone actually mega viral is, and especially on TikTok, is this video of what appears to be like a paratrooper invasion. And this one's been shared like tens of millions of times, especially on TikTok. It's happened, it's gone like onto YouTube, onto Twitter. And again, this is people taking videos from 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, like training exercises. There's examples of videos that have new audio spliced into them. So there's a bunch of videos that have gone viral on TikTok that are taking the audio of, if you recall, last year in 2020, the huge manufacturing explosion in Beirut. And there was a lot of people who happened to be filming that, and they're screaming like, "Oh my God, you know, I'm injured." People are taking that, one of those clips specifically, and just putting them on pretty innocuous footage of Ukraine and making it seem like that there are all these explosions happening. Not that there aren't explosions happening, of course, but adding to the drama and the heightened sense that everywhere in Ukraine is being attacked, and people are dying like in mass in a way that even they aren't, right? Obviously people are being killed, but elevating the scale. Yeah, do you have a hand?
Are they just monetizing the war?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting.
That's what's the messed up part about it.
Right. And to some extent, it's not even like a real effort to totally, for an individual account, right? Especially on a place like TikTok or even on Instagram, it's a lot of random people who don't have like an end game as far as like getting subscribers or any other monetization efforts. It's just an attempt to go viral, to trick people, to show up on the For You page on Instagram or on TikTok or on Twitter as like the creator of a viral video. There's no other end game that's like, you're going to get people to then subscribe to some channel or buy a shirt, or there's nothing there, right? It's just literally creating misinformation and disinformation because you can, right? Which I find to be really, really fascinating. You know, just a breakdown of what some of these things look like, especially soldiers using these platforms, like while they're actually out there. I thought that that would be something interesting to share. Hopefully, if I can click through here, we don't have the same kind of problems with our video. Let's make sure that this is actually going to work. Where's my hyperlink? Oh, okay. Well, our whole setup is going sideways here. This is an example of technology issues in action. I'm going to pull up YouTube real quick because I thought this was a really great, succinct video. Oh, I'm logged in. Perfect.
If you want to eat.
I think there's something with the sound that it's like not coming out of this device, but it's playing for the folks like really loud who are on Zoom.
So they can hear.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna change this a little bit and see how this goes.
Eat healthy and feel your best. You gotta try Kachava. Kachava is the world's healthiest all-in-one meal shake. It's made with over 70 plant-based superfoods and nutrients.
Yeah. Okay.
Giving you all your essentials in one delicious meal.
Cheers!
Oh, hell yeah.
Thank you.
Just water, 2 scoops,
Is it on this side?
Headphone speaker jack thing.
Oh, that would be, yeah, because we're
Maybe.
not using HDMI. So let's see, because we usually use the HDMI. So that might be part of our issue here.
blend and go. A complete meal in seconds.
Oh, I can
to
hear
keep
it.
you going
Faintly.
for hours. Only the highest quality plant-based ingredients to fuel your body and mind.
Okay.
Made for health-conscious people on the go.
The world's eyes are fixed on Ukraine as Russian troops, tanks and jets advance through the
Drink a
country.
little bit more.
In today's online world,
Okay.
this means the story of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is being told through social media first, in a flurry of pictures and videos. The popular video sharing app TikTok is a prime example. Normally, it would be used predominantly by teenagers and young adults to share just about anything about everyday life.
Wow, this is a clown show. I apologize, folks. I'm supposed to be the tech savvy guy. I have not used a PC in so long. I'm such a Mac person, I can't even figure out how to turn up the dang volume on this thing. Oh, there we go. Maybe. Okay, hopefully this doesn't blow everybody's ears out now.
Now,
how about that?
In today's online world, this means the story of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is being told through social media first, in a flurry of pictures and videos. The popular video sharing app TikTok is a prime example. Normally, it would be used predominantly by teenagers and young adults to share just about anything about everyday life. But now, it's been flooded with a seemingly endless stream of military activity on both sides. The speed with which video is filmed and shared online, combined with the widespread ability of phones, has created an online phenomenon which is as fascinating as it is dangerous. Open the TikTok app and you'll be bombarded with videos which appear to show Russian airstrikes and tanks, or Ukrainian troops deployed to defend their country. This type of video is on the one hand fascinating because it shows the military in a tone and in a way that's fairly uncommon. But more importantly for them, it's far more likely to reach the wider public this way. It speaks directly to the audience by being present on one of the most popular social media apps in the world. Equally, you can also find footage from the other side of what appears to be Russian troops being deployed. As Russian troops have made their way through Ukraine, the developments have been captured and shared on the popular app for the world to see.
Go, go, go! Hey!
That means videos which appear to show missile strikes and explosions are being served up to the teenagers and young adults who just a few months ago were using the app to learn new dances. The other side of this issue is the very real threat of misinformation. TikTok has around 1 billion users worldwide, and millions of videos are uploaded every day. The sheer scale of this app means videos are spread at an incredibly fast rate, which makes it nearly impossible to halt the spread of misinformation. Take this video, for example, which claims to show Ukraine defending against a Russian jet. It was posted not even a day ago, and it already has 170,000 likes. In the comments, people are sharing their concern and support for Ukraine. But on closer inspection, the footage actually comes from a video game, and isn't from the conflict at all. The same goes for thousands of other videos which are shared widely without any real way of verifying their authenticity. TikTok is used predominantly by teenagers and young adults, and the fact that it's now being overrun by war footage presents some serious concerns. Whatever your view on this, it's fascinating to see how the media has evolved. In the 19th century, images and cartoons, and eventually pictures in the 20th century brought home the reality of war to the population reading at home. In the 21st century, the Arab Spring was extensively documented and spread via Twitter. And now in 2022, the world's newest and biggest social media app is the prime way that people find information about the conflict.
Okay.
If you are struggling to lose weight and secretly want to escape from the prison of fat, then you have to see this now.
Amazing.
Dr. Lamb, a whistleblowing doctor from deep inside the weight loss industry, is breaking his code of silence. In November 20...
Well, you're welcome for all the entertainment this evening. I thought that was a great example, especially because it's actually, it's hard to, download TikTok videos and put them on a computer and everything like that, that showed you some of what, is going on this app, especially if you're not a user of TikTok, which is a very young skewing app. Just the amount of information that's being posted there, again, by folks who actually are really well-intentioned, especially in the comments, or who are liking or sharing these things, maybe not the original creators of, again, like uploading a video game clip and saying like, this is what's happening over Ukraine right now, but 170,000 plus people responding to that, and liking it and sharing it because they want to do something about the war, right? At least make people more aware. So last couple of times we've talked about what the social media and tech companies, their role in misinformation and news and media literacy. So I wanted to highlight just what they're trying to do, or what their response has been to some of this. So this is coming from some executives from Twitter talking about how they are adding a warning symbol, this stay informed little tag here that is trying to signal to people when news is being shared directly from a Russian state media site. And you can see, this is an effort that they've explored before, right? Where they've tried to label quote unquote false information about COVID or the election, right? So this is their move oftentimes, is labeling this, eventually potentially deleting it or blocking accounts. Interestingly, the folks at Facebook, or Meta as better called now, which owns Facebook and Instagram, they actually shared a lot of their information on Twitter, which I found to be odd. But an executive from Meta, I'm never gonna get that right, was talking about what are they doing, right? So they're like minimizing in the algorithm, in link sharing accounts that are affiliated with Russia and Russia state media. They're doing similar things with adding those tags. I'm curious what people think about that as a strategy, right? We know that a lot of people get their news via social media. That's not necessarily good or bad. Is this the approach that we want to see the social media companies take by like flagging these posts as, be careful or be aware? Do you think that's the right strategy to pursue to get people to find other information? Is there a better way to do it?
I was gonna say maybe it's better than nothing.
Better than nothing.
Oh, it's definitely the right direction.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's not obviously not gonna stop everybody from sharing wrong disinformation, but
Yeah.
maybe it'll make people stop and think.
Yeah, I think in this case, they made an effort to say like if these things are like Russia affiliated, or Russian state media affiliated especially. But I noticed even like with the COVID related ones, right? They kind of have a blanket approach where like if you post anything on Facebook or Instagram, right, that's about COVID, even like I got my vaccine or whatever, often that stuff gets tagged, right? As like, be careful about your information with COVID. So it's not a case by case basis. It's oftentimes like they're doing an algorithmic filtering of, is this word being used? We flag it, right? So I find that to be an interesting way to do this. Obviously, they're blocking and deleting posts. Like so many of the articles I was reading in preparation for this, was referencing this tweet or this video or this TikTok. And so often then when you would click, it had already been removed or had been deleted. The problem is, of course, especially on a platform like TikTok, especially where things move so fast, the videos are generally so short, it's easy to see a lot of them quickly. You're just playing whack-a-mole with this stuff as far as trying to put it away or hide it or delete the accounts after the stuff has already gone pretty super viral, right? So one of the things that gets us into a deeper conversation about misinformation, disinformation, and fake news is this incident, this event that's happening right now, right? And I think what's something to underline is that these visual-oriented platforms like Instagram, like TikTok, are especially subject to misinformation and disinformation because generally we have less ability to like critically analyze a photo or a video compared to, when we see text, we've been trained in school informally to like understand and capture when something might not be totally accurate or there's not really evidence. Like we can capture that, right? If you don't have a lot of training with visual storytelling, with visual framing, with what, can be done in a digital environment with photo and video, it's a lot easier to just swipe through something, think it's real, and maybe not think too much about it beyond that, right? So both TikTok and Instagram in particular encourage users obviously to stay within their ecosystem. Both of them make it difficult to share links. So it's really easy to post a photo or video and not necessarily embed the source or link to anything. And they encourage people to just keep swiping, right? Which all these platforms do in one way or another. But that encourages people to, or it discourages people from leaving the app and actually reading about the thing they're looking at, right? And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of data that shows, and survey data and things like that, that shows like when people have an emotional connection to an issue or a topic, they're far more willing to share information about it, right? It's passionate confirmation bias in action. And when we're talking about something like an invasion or a war where you feel like there's nothing you can really do here in the United States, so what can you do? Well, you can share a video, or you can try to raise awareness or things like that. And that increases the chances that you might share something that's not totally accurate, right? Even by trying to do good, I think. And that's an important way to think about this, because so often when we talk about fake news or disinformation, the combo is all about like bad actors, like people who are specifically putting this stuff out there to make us confused or to convince us something about a politician or about a foreign country. And that is true, that obviously does occur, but the uptake of this stuff, how it gets shared, is often by us accidentally, innocuously thinking like, oh, that's interesting, or oh, I really care about it. Or time and time again, people are interviewed, like, they go through a process, a survey, where they are asked, is something real or fake? And would they share it? And they end up saying that they would share something that ultimately is fake. And they're asked, like, why do you do that? Or why do you believe X or Y? And it's often just like, I don't know, it's interesting, or it's funny, right? And there's that quick moment of like, whatever, I'm just sharing something on Facebook, or I'm just sharing a video on TikTok. I'm not really thinking that much about it, but the long-term effects of that is
still a selfish act.
Go ahead, follow up on
One
that.
person, it's a selfish act. They're doing it for themselves. They're not really doing it for anyone.
Yeah.
They may find it interesting, but they're sharing it for their own likes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even if you don't consciously think like I'm doing this for the likes, social media encourages you to kind of put yourself at the center of all events, right? Something's happening in the world. How does that affect me, the main character of the universe, right? And I need to have an opinion on it, or I need my friends to see that I care about it. So I'm sharing the right resources, right? You're retweeting somebody who's asking for donations or whatever, right? So all of that, these platforms encourage you to like get involved and be emotionally charged, and not to like think critically about it, right? Which is the thing we always come back to about media literacy, is you got to slow down, you got to think critically. These platforms discourage all of that, right? They want you to just kind of keep going and keep sharing. That's, as we talked about at the outset here, the paradox of this current news environment with the current tools that we have at our disposal, right? That if you want to, you can follow what's happening in Ukraine 24/7 for as long as you want, right? And you can be, have your phone open on social media and have it on cable news, right? And you can get as much information as you want. But to some extent, you're telling whoever it is, whether that's through conventional television ratings or on social media, you're telling the algorithms, right? Like, as you look at that stuff over and over again, even if you know, like, that's fake, I'm actually researching this to find out what's real, you're just telling the algorithm, like, give me more of that stuff, right? Give me more of it, whether it's fake or not. And that is a really complicated situation that's hard to get out of, right? Which is why there are all of these articles in the last week about like, how much of this should you consume? How long should you be on your phone looking at Ukrainian videos from Ukraine or whatever? And it also like plays out in weird ways, right? Because obviously people respond to this stuff in their own way, in complicated ways, and trying to get as many likes or get more followers, right? And so you see there's been a huge increase of people just doing joke posts about like being in World War III, right? Including this one here that is trying to triangulate a bunch of different or a few different contemporary events, right? So me in the World War III trenches doing my daily Wordle, right? So like trying to pull together different current events and making a joke about what's happening, which obviously that this is not a social media creation, but you see a lot of that. If you keyword search for World War III on a platform like Twitter, there's tons of posts and videos and things like this, right? So that effect of seeing all of those videos, of seeing the updates, the legitimate stuff, the illegitimate stuff, the jokes, right? It just has this really complicated impact on us, right? And I think then you see articles, NPR got sort of really skewered last week because they did an article about like how long should you read the news about Ukraine? Like, what should you do when you've read news for a couple of hours? Like, how should you take care of yourself? Like self-care related to Ukraine. And obviously there were some responses to people like, well, the people in Ukraine like don't have the opportunity to like log off, right? So you need to pay attention to this as much as you can. But there is a limit. Everybody has a limit for the amount of information that they can consume. Yeah, absolutely.
Is there a limit? Like, I feel that they take like a 24-hour news cycle is wrong, but is there a study that says this amount of time is too long?
Yeah, I can't say specific numbers, but like in general, there's a thought that you shouldn't be, you know, just injecting this stuff into your brain for hours at a time every single day, right? I think there's,
we don't have
right, it has long-term effects on, short-term and long-term effects on your mental health, your physical health, your ability to pay attention, your ability to focus on one task, right? Your diet, all that stuff is really connected in one way or another. And I think when we have these huge world incidents, that just accelerates, right? Because you want to be informed, right? And I think that's where it can get really tricky, is a lot of the folks who are spending the most time reading this stuff are well-intentioned. They're not the ones spreading disinformation on purpose. They're just feeling like, man, this is awful. I want to know as much about it as possible. You know, I think these platforms, there's a lot of reporting that shows that these platforms are increasingly prioritizing vertical video. So video shot on phones, you know, typically in a vertical orientation, because people view those as like more authentic or user generated instead of professionally produced. And so if you've got a lot of vertical videos, you know, in Kyiv, right, of what's happening, then the algorithm and the structures of these social platforms are automatically going to elevate those. And ultimately what's happened is we have a different threshold for like sharing information and consuming information. We're less worried about necessarily like newsworthy or relevant, and more like, oh, this is interesting or weird or funny. It's a joke about World War III in the world. I'm going to share that. We're not necessarily as focused on like true and factual. So that gets us into this broader conversation, which could take up, you know, hours. But where we are with misinformation, disinformation, fake news, right? Three concepts, three terms that are often intertwined, that are worth delineating and talking about on their own and how they relate to one another. So just so we're all clear, misinformation is false info, but there's not that malice, right? A specific intent to mislead or fabricate. Disinformation is that next level, right? Deliberately creating or sharing information that is false, often with a particular agenda, right? So we have, you know, the very classic example of like legit propaganda by a state government or a corporation. But then there's also a growing sense, and research bears some of this out, that, you know, especially with the ability to pay for bot networks, just, you know, automated accounts that will just share stuff that you can control on a high level. It's not even, there's not even a direct effort to set a very specific agenda. It is just an overall effort to disorient readers and people who are online, to, you know, obfuscate and make people confused about what's going on, about what is true. It's not to convince people of one thing. It's to make people think that, you know, literally anything can be true, right? And to create confusion and paranoia. And then we have fake news, right? Which is really a hyper contemporary term for a long historical process, if we're being charitable, of heightened or misleading reporting, right? Often with the idea of, you know, trying to get the most attention, whether that's to get people to click, to get people to watch, to go, you know, back to the conventional historical yellow journalism era in American journalism, right? Of, you know, getting people to literally stop at the newsstand and pick up the paper and buy it, right? But I think when we see fake news, like as a term, as a concept in contemporary discourse, it's more commonly used as a political tool, right? Where politicians, celebrities, even athletes, when a story is written about them that puts them in an unflattering light, that is generally accepted or believed to be true, they use fake news as a concept, right? To tweet or to post and to say, you know, that's fake news. That news organization as a whole is illegitimate. And that creates a lot of complications. It has created a lot of complications for specific news organizations and for journalism as a whole, right? And, you know, some of my students are joining us on Zoom and they've heard this before, but I think it really trickles down to the public, where if you look at some of the survey data that I showed the first night we did this, the trust in institutions, in news is, you know, just like a straight arrow downward. And part of that is the rhetoric about fake news, that when people don't like what's reported about them, even if it's true, they just say it's fake news, right? What do people think about that as far as like when you encounter fake news as a concept? Do you see that, you know, do you think that fake news is like a real thing or just a tool that people use? What do we think?
The previous president kind of ruined the term. Was ever going to have a difference to you?
Yeah.
Because he came out front, right? Anything that was negative against him, automatically fake news.
Right.
It dumbs it down, desensitizes people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, President Trump obviously created an environment where most or anything that was written about him that he didn't like, it was just blanket, right? It's fake news. And even would go after individual news organizations as a whole, right? That they're just, even ones that, you know, he would give information to like Maggie Haberman at the New York Times, right? Like he was a source, he would answer calls from her, but then would still publicly do the fake news dance, right? That everything that the New York Times does, and you know, that then we get failing New York Times, all of that stuff, right?
I think people realize that there's rules journalists are supposed to follow.
Yeah.
We learn about those in school, but it doesn't seem like there's a disconnect now. People don't realize that there's supposed to be a code that they follow.
Yeah.
And they're usually, like New York Times, they're pretty good about it. They all make mistakes.
Right.
Usually they're pretty good about it.
Right.
But people just put that in the same context as Facebook, which is totally different.
Right.
Journalism is a skill.
Right. Yeah, and I think that there's a complicated way that, you know, journalistic content or output, you know, when we look at a platform, whether that's Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, right? When we're searching for news on those spaces, legitimate journalism is right there next to a random person's thoughts. It's right there next to a politician's tweet. It's right there next to, you know, somebody literally trying to share disinformation, and all of that stuff just kind of smashes together. And there's a sense that most people, I think, feel, or when I ask them this, it comes up that like what they're encountering on social media might not be entirely legitimate, but you can never totally point to specific examples time after time of like, okay, that's a fake news. That's an example of fake news. There's just a sense among the American public in particular that journalism is rife with fake news. And it's really not, but that doesn't mean, as you suggested, that journalists don't mess up, that they don't have an agenda, right? That they're not trying to get people to click or subscribe or watch, right? They do have all those things, but it's not as if they're generally like just sitting at their computers every day thinking about all the fake stuff that they could come up with to get people to click, right? And so I think that whole idea of fake news has created an environment that makes it really difficult to kind of talk about misinformation and disinformation and how we might potentially fall for these things, or why we might fall for them, or what really is misinformation and disinformation, right? So just some general polling data that backs a little of that up, right? And this is in 2016, and I think there's probably similar ideas happening or similar responses that we could see in 2020, 2021, and so on. That the majority of the folks polled by Pew, and I use them a lot, great resource for kind of cross-sectional survey data. 64% think like a great deal of confusion has been created by made-up news, right? And that creates confusion about basic facts, agreed upon facts related to what happened in the election, Do vaccines work? Do masks work? Things like that, right? In an even more recent study or survey that Pew found that 23% of the folks surveyed, could not correctly identify any of the news sources that they saw, like how they did their own reporting or if they did their own reporting. So they were given multiple examples of news articles from different sources and then asked to identify where's the evidence coming from? How did they get that, right? So this goes back to what you were talking about as far as people don't know what journalists are actually doing, right? They articles come to them, they see them. There's not a total understanding about the work that journalists actually do to even produce a 250-word article, right? And in that same survey, roughly half of Americans or more were able to correctly identify whether 3 of 6 sources. So, a good amount were able to say okay, I can see in some of these sources, I get what they're doing, but 3 of 6 understanding evidence and understanding where information comes from is still not that great, right? So I think when we think about fake news or misinformation and disinformation, it's often in the context of a Facebook post or a tweet or a viral video gone wrong. Where it's actually happening quite a bit is these astroturfed websites that are intended to look like conventional news sources, right? One of the things that I think is the trickiest about this, in the pure journal story, is not in this wheelhouse totally, but a lot of local newspapers or local news sources that have a website, their website's not the best, right? It's not the most beautiful, it's not the most user-friendly. It doesn't look like the New York Times website, for instance. That reality allows for these completely manufactured news sources to create websites that look pretty comparable, meaning they don't look super great or super professional, and they create completely fake, completely artificial, false news articles that have salacious headlines that are easily shareable on Facebook, right? So this doesn't look like the most credible thing you've ever seen, probably, but it also doesn't look like the most incredible thing you've ever seen, right? This was a high-profile example around the 2016 election in the whole stew of information about Hillary Clinton's emails and email servers and her relationship to the CIA. This is the CIA investigation, things like that. I should say FBI, I apologize. I want to get my information correct. This is a heightened example of that, but this is one that was posted just a few days before the 2016 election that later researchers found had circulated a crazy amount, especially on Facebook, right? And this is one that there was this completely made up incident where an FBI agent shot and killed his wife and then set their home on fire. And, they were drawing connections that this was an agent who was investigating Hillary Clinton and her emails in the Clinton Foundation and basically found out too much, right? And it doesn't say that totally directly in the email, but the headline, connects those things together. And this is where a lot of this information comes from, or this sort of fake information comes from. I'm going to come back to this actually here, because I wanted to show this example in this story. So one of the things I say in these sessions all the time is how all of this is super connected, which is what that cheesy tree graphic underlines, and I'll come back to. But part of the reason there's so much disinformation and actual false news, let's get away from fake, false information, is that local news is struggling so badly. And so all across the country, including in Illinois, these screenshots are of Illinois news sources, where there are weekly newspapers, not the highest level of daily news production, but weekly newspapers in the suburbs of different places all across the country. And then websites that are popping up that are completely funded by political parties or political operatives. There was a great story in the New York Times a few years ago about this. there's this whole operation of over 1,000 websites and newspapers that are all funded by GOP groups and supporters and, you know, millionaires who have a lot of money to bankroll this stuff. The screenshot is here. Obviously, you don't, you know, have to read this whole thing, but on the left-hand side, it describes the scene of basically a struggling journalist who's just like trying to make money doing this, and how, you know, she got a $22 email assignment, or an assignment via email, to write a hit piece essentially on Sarah Gideon, who was running for Senate in Maine. And it was just going to go up on one of these websites. And it was basically like, not anything newsworthy, just we need a negative article about her, right? Because her polling is good. And on the right-hand side here, Maine Business Daily is part of a fast-growing network of nearly 1,300 websites that aim to fill a void left by vanishing local newspapers across the country. Yet the network, now in all 50 states, is built not on traditional journalism, but on propaganda ordered out by dozens of conservative think tanks, political operatives, corporate executives, and public relations professionals. A Times investigation found. What's important about this is that the sites appear ordinary, like they don't look super great, but they don't look terrible. They have newsy or newspaper names like the Des Moines Sun, the Ann Arbor Times, the Empire State Today. They employ simple layouts and articles about local politics, community happenings, and sometimes national issues, like any local paper or website. But most of the stories, especially ones that are politically charged, are all astroturfed and created by these various operatives. And there's one here that I wanted to show that was in the story, the Illinois Valley Times, for instance. As far as news websites go, local news websites go, that actually looks pretty credible, right? It looks like a decent, not high profile, but functional news website. And for people who aren't aware, it is, right? They cover local sports, they cover, you know, the city council meeting, they cover the 4-H fair, right? They cover all of that stuff. But a lot of it, especially when we're talking about city government or state government or, you know, contracts, businesses, things like that, it's all produced with a very, very specific agenda, often with completely false information. So I think this is the type of stuff that we don't think about when we think about false news, or we think about disinformation. It's often turned outward towards right now, right? So much of the information or the reporting out there is about disinformation from Russia, right? Specifically from the Russian government or Russian state-owned media. But there are these things that are happening within our own country, that are happening specifically targeting people in our country, right? And they're not just weird Facebook videos that are trying to rile people up for likes. There are also these sophisticated infrastructures that are intended to look like not super sophisticated, because that gives it a level of authenticity or realism, that are trying to convince people day after day after day of something that's not super real, right?
Good question, though. I'm not real savvy about who owns these things.
Yeah.
Doesn't Jeff Bezos own the Washington Post?
He sure does, yeah.
And would the same thing apply there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the biggest critique that you can levy at basically any of the conventional news organizations as well, like the big ones, the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times. They're either owned by billionaires with very specific agendas of their own, or they're owned by, in the case of the New York Times, like it's a big public company with shareholders that their goal is to get more money every quarter, right?
That said, Jeff Bezos isn't an institution or group,
right?
Like a Republican or conservative group,
right?
But there's the possibility that, I mean, I don't know that well, but I do think he maybe tends to lean left or whatever.
Yeah.
Or maybe I just don't even know.
Right.
You know, they don't like that.
That's the big thing, is that for years, and they've like sort of pretended to loosen that, but they had like an internal rule that like you cannot literally, there are things that are like you can't write about it because he's the owner, right? Which has happened in the long history of media, right?
Yeah.
But it is certainly more complicated. Yeah, and I think that
media own like all of the newspapers. here.
Yes.
Like, you go to Beacon Times website, it's the same.
Yes.
And it's
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the only difference, and it's a big difference, right? It's not just like a distinction without a difference or, you know, something like that. The people who work for those places are generally following the types of ethics and structures that, but yeah, I mean,
There you can see, if you scroll down, you see the fact articles too.
yes.
Right, yeah.
And you want, you know, the thing that I always talk about, and it's so hard to kind of parse, right, is that like oftentimes, even in this story, like the journalist who gets the email to like write that article, it's just like, you know, probably somebody out of college who's like trying to make it as a journalist, who's trying to take any work that they can get, right, because it's not a thriving industry for individual journalists oftentimes, right? So individual journalists are rarely the ones who are like actively trying to circulate disinformation or fake news, but there are all these broader structural problems, whether it's ownership or the death of local newspapers in a lot of ways, that create the conditions for this stuff to happen, whether it's totally astroturfed conservative news. And there are tons of liberal leaning websites just like this. There's not the same kind of infrastructure like this impressive example of what this stuff looks like, but there are tons of like liberal websites and liberal think tanks that are trying to pump up completely made up stuff about conservatives. Yeah.
I mean, it used to be okay at the Huffington Post.
Yeah.
The 2016 election, it was just complete trash.
Right, and it's been bought and sold multiple times, and they have all sorts of, you know, like things that they're trying to accomplish professionally and, you know, from an ad standpoint and things like that, right? So one of the things that I just wanted, since we're about out of time here, and I'll share this in the slides that we post later in the video. This is a really great guide that I was pulling from when I was making some slides, and then I realized like there's no need to just pull from this. I'll just show it because it has a really great toolkit for how to think about identifying fake information, what to do when you encounter it, especially online. It's from The Verge, which is a tech website owned by Vox Media, which has its own, you know, baggage and certainly leans more politically in the American context, certainly more liberal. But this site is mostly like tech forward, right? They're thinking about technology and society, and they have this great resource throughout here, or some great resources throughout here, about how to approach this type of information online, and thinking about when you encounter something like, when should you, just in the back of your mind, be like, I don't know about this, right? And they note here is like really sharpening your sense of when you can recognize things are true and how you do that. And you often, when you get used to, just like anything, you get the reps of understanding like, I don't think that's real, or that's been taken out of context. You get more comfortable with it, right? And they give you a bunch of different tips here that I think are really great about when you might be in trouble when you encounter information. Like, so if you do have a strong emotional reaction to a story, as we talked about, if you're really pissed or it's intended to like really be a tearjerker, that might be a signal, this is trying to really motivate me to share or think differently about this. But then there are other things here that I think are really useful as well. Like if it seems totally ridiculous, okay, but if it's ridiculous and still kind of confirms what you already believe, then there's also a tendency to share it, right? It confirms your priors, right? Going back to what we were talking about earlier, right? If you feel like you have to like pay to access something to get more, you know, if there's like a call to action for like, you know, political fundraising or something in that story, or at the end of the story, or there's a Twitter thread or a Facebook post that leads to that type of thing, that's suspicious in one way or another. And again, if you want to actually immediately share it because you think that it's important or that it is going to amplify this message or this incident or this issue, that might be a moment to just take a second and think like, okay, why do I feel that way? What are other people saying about this? What are the sources I trust saying about this? So that's a place to start, right? And we can always pick up with this in future sessions. Obviously, there's so much to get into. But I'll share this in with the video and with the Zoom and everything like that, because there's tons of great tips here as far as like where to go to find legal documents, to find public documents, to make sure that you encounter what we would call like primary text, right? Like video, audio of people saying things if you're encountering a quote, right? Is that a real quote, or has it been taken out of context? Is it from, 20 years ago and somehow is now being added? Or you see on Facebook or on social media all the time, like famous people being attributed by saying something political like 20 years ago and predicting what was going to happen that like they've never said that, right? So there's a lot of great resources in this article that I'll share. And I'll leave it at that just because I don't want to take too much more time. Does anyone have any questions or comments or anything about?
If you can't hold the creator accountable, like we are now, like I learned a lot of this in political science class. And
Sure.
Philosophy, you have to read it top to bottom. You have to know the bias.
Yeah.
Get those things out, but people aren't doing that nowadays.
Right.
So do you hold the creator accountable?
I mean, I think that's one of the
journalism rules before, right?
Right.
But how do you hold Facebook?
Yeah, and I mean this is the question that I always pose. And in a future session, we'll talk all about the tech side, like the tech company side of it. It's the question I always pose, right? I always say like, okay, we agree that these are the issues. We agree that Facebook, Meta, whatever, that these companies contribute at best to the circulation of this stuff, right? Do we then hold them accountable? And oftentimes people say, yeah. And then I say, okay, what does holding them accountable actually look like? What does that mean? Do we fine them? Do we, because we've had congressional hearing after congressional hearing and they get up there and they say, we're going to come up with a new tag or we're going to do this. And people say, okay, maybe that. And then oftentimes, and I'm not critiquing anybody for this, but so often I say like, should we just delete Facebook? Like, should we just say, we're turning it off? Like, we're turning it off. And then people are like, I don't know about that. Like there's a sense that like, that's getting, the government's having too much of a strong hand in that. Yeah, and I mean, these.
Not too fast, too far. We can't keep up.
No, I agree. I think that's how, isn't that how all laws come to be? Because we can't trust people to be commonsensical about things. So.
Right, so why we have seatbelts. That's why we have stop signs. Right.
Right, you won't wear your seatbelt, you won't go with the right speed limit, you won't not do drugs that are harmful for you.
Right.
So then we become this big government because the common sense has gone out the window.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think that the other complication that it is difficult to talk about without getting like super political, and I have done it in arenas and it's gone poorly. It's just like talking about how, like on all sides, no matter what they say publicly, so many of the, all of the social media companies and the CEOs, the people who run them, like they're donating to both political parties. They're playing both sides of the political system. No matter what those politicians say, they're oftentimes taking money from these CEOs and these companies. And so they're so intertwined into the political and economic system in our country. Facebook, Google, all these companies make so much money off of advertising that drives large chunks of the like American and global economies, that if we were to say like no more, then there's this whole economic impact of that we basically don't want to touch as a political system. But then we have all these hearings about like, well, what are you going to do about this, Mark? And he basically says like, we're going to delete more posts or whatever. And it's always after the fact, right? Something horrible has happened. And then we call Mark Zuckerberg in front of the public and basically, slap him on the nose with the newspaper, and then nothing changes, right? There's a new thing. There's always something. And it's true for all of these platforms. It's not just a Facebook issue. And now we have TikTok in the mix, right? Which is, not even an American company in the way that some of these other ones are, right? Which makes it even more complicated. So I think it's a great question, right? Like you see so much of it being targeted towards countries, right? So like so much of the conversation about fake news, even before the last 2 weeks, has been like, it's the Russians, right? Like so much of it is targeted towards Putin this, Putin that. He has this relationship with Trump. That's what helped AstroTurf the 2016 election and turn people against Hillary. And there is evidence of some of that, but there's also conflicting evidence that suggests that like people didn't read as many of the stories like the one I showed that maybe we thought, right? And maybe it didn't have a total effect, and maybe people just didn't like Hillary Clinton as a candidate, right? And or thought Trump was going to be a different type of politician or whatever, right? So it's hard to like grasp this issue because it's so complicated, it's so intertwined with politics and education and the economy, right? And these things that make it really difficult, that when we have these big events, we can point to stuff and say, like, well, that's a fake video or that's an untrue article. But when you start thinking about solutions, it's so much just like, well, you got to slow down and read. It's like, well, I can slow down as much as I want. That doesn't stop much of this from happening, right? Not to like defeat the purpose of these sessions, right? Like, I think we all should come to these sessions and think about these things more deeply. But us meeting doesn't like hold Mark Zuckerberg more accountable for what his company has done to people's brains, right? Which is, I think, ultimately like a net negative effect, right? Unfortunately.
I think too, Dr. Margaret, that there's been such a merge of opinion into journalism in this country.
Sure.
People don't understand
Yes.
what journalism is.
Yeah.
Especially with the cable news, like these are
Yeah.
In all facets.
their opinion guys.
Right.
They're the most popular people on the news channel.
Right.
Their opinion.
Right.
And
Yeah.
they call themselves news stations
Right.
or news shows,
Right.
and they're not.
Right.
They're just people up there spewing.
Yeah, it's mostly entertainment with like information baked into it. Yeah, and I mean, in my classes, like with undergrads, and when I've done things with the OLLI program here in Peoria, we often talk about that, and like we go through literally like a section of a website and sort of say, like, you know, the opinion section is supposed to be, you know, kind of framed off, right? Like, especially online, or if you look at a newspaper, there's a whole op-ed section. But even newspapers are blurring that line, right? The New York Times has like what they call analysis sections, which is like they give a journalist who covers a beat. Occasionally they get the opportunity to like analyze the situation, which is just another word for opinion, right? And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, but that creates, yeah, and it blurs the line, and it's one thing for the journalist to be able to say, like, I understand the differences between those things. It's a completely other thing to assume that your audience knows the difference between those things.
How do you look with those numbers that you showed before?
Yeah.
Is they don't understand the difference.
Right.
They think if Tom Smith always reports this, and
Yeah.
all of a sudden now you start seeing opinion, they take that as factual.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a whole ecosystem too of like journalists who are traditional, you know, like what we would call in J school, like a capital J journo, right? Like somebody who is a reporter, dogged reporter. And if they do really well, if you're a good national reporter in 2022, very quickly you're going to end up where? On TV, right? You're going to end up on TV, and that completely changes your persona, that changes the work that you do potentially.
That's kind of an emphasis.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and even if people continue to do a great job in that context, right? Like when you're a figure who shows up on TV, the way the questions are framed to you, the panels that you participate in, you're now in a different type of ecosystem. Even if you're kind of with like retaining your own ethics and processes, you're now on a panel with 4 other random people who are yelling at each other, and now you're part of that whole entertainment complex, right? And I think that goes back to these structural issues, right? That are not just individual journalists who are at fault or were at fault for not slowing down. That like the incentives for journalists for their career are to like end up on TV, right? Like that's a good thing for them because that probably leads to a book deal, that leads to a podcast, that leads to the things that like actually help you make money as a journalist, which is not the easiest career to like make money in. Did you have another thing? Did you say there were 2 things? Okay. Any other thoughts?
People like to be outraged. They're given,
Yes.
consuming the information
Yes.
that they're giving us.
Right. And that's a big part of this. And again, I think what is so interesting about this is like talking to different groups of people, right? Like, it's so easy, and I did here tonight, right, to point out the complications of all of this that are brought forth by social media. But there's historical parallels, cable TV, you know, things dating back, newspapers, radio, all that, right? And it's a lot of that's still happening today where even if the reporting is good, I use this as an example all the time, right? That like for a traditional newspaper and newspaper website, most conventional thing you can think of, you know, the journalist reports the story and then somebody else writes the headline, picks the photo, picks the size of the font for the headline, right? That completely can reframe and repackage the presentation of that news. And the individual reporter, and I speak about this from my own personal experience, I was just like an entertainment reporter, but you know, it would happen to me occasionally where I would write something and they would pick a headline that would encourage people to click that wasn't totally like what I was talking about or who I was talking to. And then I would get like angry tweets or angry emails. It's like, I don't pick the headline, I'm sorry, you know, but that's a big part of it too. Just like the pushing the button of like emotion, right? Whether that's rage, whether that's making you cry, right? And that's what we see in these viral videos or whatever, right? News organizations have been doing that for years, right? Because they have these commercial imperatives in this country where the ultimate goal is we got to get people to subscribe, we got to get people to watch, we got to, you know, get more ad support, right? And that is a really tricky system to get out of. And then you add this whole structure of the social media companies who are even less beholden to ethics or the government or some of the economic restrictions that newspapers find themselves in. And it's just even more complicated, right?
So to bring it back to the guy at the beginning, and then we'll let Dr. Barker go, but
Yeah.
the guy at the beginning of the TikTok stuff, his quote was, "It's fascinating and dangerous."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's when I heard it say that, I thought, well, that sums it up.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and it's really hard to blame anybody for what they do. And I think that's a big part of this series is, right, like all of us have habits that like, if we really, really were asked, you know, like we were given like a wish or whatever, like we would want to stop doing this, right? Related to media or news or devices. But like we all have them, we all do it, whether it's a different website or watching cable news instead of looking at our phone or whatever, right? It's so hard to, but like so many things in our world, like we often frame it as like, what can an individual person do differently instead of pointing out the structural institutional problems that exist, whether that's economic or political or even just professional, like the incentives you might have as a journalist to go on TV or to be a little bit more animated on social media so you can get more attention, right? It's so hard to say that like us changing our habits is really going to shift any of this, right? Like if we just slow down or we don't look at Twitter, well, like it's still going to exist, right? And it's really hard to say that everybody's going to do that, right? That, you know, social movements have limitations for one reason or another. Thank you so much, folks. I really appreciate it. Thank you to the folks online. Sorry for some of the technical issues. Next month, we are going to talk about the tech companies and their role in this, since we got into that quite a bit tonight. I think that'll be a nice extension. We do these the first Thursday of the month. We'll do them for the rest of the year, 6 o'clock here and online. If this is your first session, sign in over here and we'll give you some more email information and remind you coming up. For any folks online, thank you so much. And thanks everybody who came tonight. Really appreciate it. What do we remember our date? It's
April 7th.
April 7th. Great. Thursday, April 7th, 6 p.m. Thanks, folks. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.